Gonna go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
You good, Brian?
Yep.
All right, sounds good. So nothing major changed from our last meeting here on the goals and objectives that we were talking about. I do want to note that we kind of added supporting language within these strategies here. So our intention with our subcommittees was to go over the goals and objectives so that you all would feel confident in the large ideas that were coming forward. And then we would work with the steering committee, other city staff, and with our consultants to really generate more specific supporting strategies. A number of the strategies that you see here were listed objectives already in our conversation. So they're really just more specific than what we were looking for the general objectives supporting the goals. So when we look at things like examining the establishment of a full-time position for a transit coordinator for the city of Winona, before we had an objective there saying create a full-time transit coordinator. Well, what's the actual intention of that? It's to consider increasing staff and support, which is to support the improved public transportation system.
Can you make it a little bigger?
My apologies. Sorry about that.
We're not in college here.
So what I want to do is I want to kind of run through and see if anything sticks out like a sore thumb, see if anything really doesn't jive with what you have been speaking about, because if you all don't feel confident in what you've been telling us, and the document doesn't reflect what you've been telling us, then jobs. We know that these are large documents for every one of our subcommittees, and we expect our steering committee to want to kind of pare some of it down. We expect some of it will slowly dwindle with our planning commission and with city council. So throwing a lot at the board isn't necessarily a bad thing. So overall goals to improve public transportation in Winona and promote increased use, lowering the cost barriers to use, implementing user-friendly technology to make transit use the easy option for movement through the city, considering increased staffing support for transit in the city, holistically considering the transit network beyond existing bus service, that should be service, to connect other transportation options. Any concerns there overall? Calling out some ambitious things here in technology, like an app. You know, we're going to join 21st century and we're going to do this, maybe, possibly,
Maybe.
potentially. In 15 years, it's a big plan, right?
About it, right?
It's a big plan. Okay. Moving on to bike lane infrastructure investments that connect destinations and integrate with other transportation services. So connecting transit stops and destinations with bicycle infrastructure, meeting modern standards for bike infrastructure, expanding recreational bike paths along the lakes to the west and the east, establishing improved crossings across Highway 61, and connections to the middle school for safe crossings across Highway 61. Some of this is already happening. We've already had an improvement at 61 and Huff, for example. We're not calling for a specific improvement. The actual roundabout that's currently going swimmingly, no complaints, right, Ryan? Over at 61 and Mankato Avenue. Things are going well.
Super smooth.
Those are the types of connections that we need to see going on. We do have a safe routes to schools. It literally has always just said safe routes to schools in our last two discussions. So considering a safe routes to schools program, because we don't currently have one with Winona Area Public Schools, this would be a partnership opportunity. Obviously, it would require political will from two entities, the city and the public school district. Connecting schools with recreation areas via traffic calm streets. So using streets like 7th Street to make sure that we actually have those types of connections. Any concerns there? Continuing to support the use of the Mississippi River for commerce, recreation, and transportation. Here we wanted to talk about balancing the needs of the transportation, recreation, and environment, promoting recreational use and opportunities along the Mississippi River. And here I kind of moved some of the signage concerns from objectives underneath here, because we really were talking about how does a casual user know how to get to the river and utilize it. Support the riverfront trail and its associated shared use path network, which we all talked about, I believe, in our second meeting, and signage and communications for river access and types of use. So boat landing, swimming, what actually can I do at a specific location? And that's felt separate enough to call it out as compared to more of a wayfinding component. Any concerns, comments? All right. Brian, I don't want to forget about you. Let me know.
We're good.
All right. Our next goal was improving the rail system in Winona in terms of both passenger rail and freight transportation in a manner that minimizes conflicts with the city's motorized and non-motorized transportation system. So supporting those objectives are supporting the rail industry as a viable means of goods movement and passenger transportation, improving safety where there are conflict points between rail and other forms of movement, and coordinating with other transportation systems for smooth flow of passenger services for all entities. A lot of this, of course, relies on partnerships with railroad companies who, as we all know, have more power than God. So we will, of course, tread carefully with them. Oh, and improving amenities near passenger rail. So how can we turn the Amtrak station into something that's actually going to be to the city?
Is there any benefit in a document like this to distinguish things that can be done exclusively by the city versus things that would require? I mean, I assume that everyone who's using this document understands the difference between being able to improve grade crossings and being able to rezone. But is there any benefit to like distinguishing the two?
I think it depends slightly. So we're looking so far out with this document that when we say something like improving grade crossings, right now that means, of course, that we're partly beholden to the willingness of railroad companies to want to work with us on doing that. That might change in 10 years. That might change in 5 years.
Sure.
Not that I expect it to, but I do think that there is some benefit to flexibility in that regard. I don't know if that's a good answer.
But like lumping all those things, but I guess what I'm asking is like lumping all those things under one goal when 3/4 of them can be achieved only when we have agreement with other entities, but one of those points could be done if there was a rezoning thing. Is that all of that in the same, like none of that gets lost in the mix, I guess is what I'm asking.
And I think what we'll do, and this came up in some other subcommittees, like for instance, community services and institutions, which talks about, you know, basically big institutions throughout the city working together not just on facility planning, but also programming and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff that subcommittee took a look at that is really not the city's purview. So in the introduction and the context of that subcommittee section, we'll basically say that a lot of this stuff is what we've heard, what needs to happen, but isn't necessarily the city's bill wiki, you know, like.
Yeah, right.
Nonetheless, the city could play a part in helping facilitate a lot of that stuff happening. And I think the same thing with this, where, you know, we can essentially put a notation at the beginning saying that a lot of this stuff, because transit is inherently involved with a lot of different multi-jurisdictional overlapping jurisdictions, that a lot of it does hinge on other people and other organizations approving.
Right.
So,
and that's a good point, is if we have something that is in here that inherently relies on a different partnership, there is some value to it, so that if that organization comes forward and says they need a resolution from the city to support applications for a grant or appealing to their board for funding, we're able to provide that.
That's in the document.
Yep.
All right. Our next goal is developing surface transportation improvements for the existing network. So improving safety and efficiency of truck traffic in Winona while minimizing impacts on residential neighborhoods, mixed use districts, and tourism attractions so as to improve the overall quality of life. It's a bit of a mouthful, but we're going to can come later if we need to. Improving the aesthetics and cleanliness of streets and roads through streetscape and landscape improvements and code enforcement. And thank you for the code enforcement note, Brian. I think that's really good. A couple of meetings ago, incorporating traffic calming measures in future street construction and to address identified neighborhood problems. So context sensitive design and all of that. Responding to and implementing the complete streets policy and pedestrian bicycle plan when presenting items to governing bodies. So when we come forward with CIP plans, et cetera, you know, understanding that our planning commission and our city council know what we're actually looking at. Evaluating the existing street network for access to businesses and ease of movement for all users within existing pavement widths and existing rights of ways. This was a conversation with Sean Koner a little bit ago about one-way streets, and we had one-way streets as its own objective, but I think that what he was really trying to get at is, are there ways for us to rethink orientation? So I moved that into a strategy underneath kind of this more broad objective here. Prioritizing ADA compliance citywide. Here we had a dementia-friendly separate goal, and I slid that under ADA compliance. It's not technically ADA compliance, but I think that the intention is more toward accessibility. And then making rail crossing improvements that are safe, convenient, and comfortable. And then we had that as a separate standalone objective that I also slid under here. And I'll get rid of Carrie's egg test, but for now it lives on. All right, so our next goal was establishing a safe and efficient non-motorized transportation system that accesses all parts of Winona and the regional trails network. So our objectives for that were to expand the city's network of sidewalks and crosswalks in order to provide safe, convenient, and comfortable pedestrian access through Winona. Our second was to expand the network of bicycle and pedestrian trails that provide transportation use along with recreation use. And our third was expand and improve the on-street bicycle network in order to safely connect bicycle commuters and recreational riders with trails and destinations. Our fourth was to promote the use of linear parks, and here I put or parkways, through the public rights of way to connect recreational destinations so that movement is safe, convenient, and comfortable and can be accomplished without a motor vehicle. That gets to those connection points in the Parks and Recreation Master Plan more than anything else. Any concerns about that goal and associated objectives? It didn't change dramatically from last time we looked at this. Our next goal was to promote and improve the public transportation system as a viable alternative to driving alone. The objectives for that were to promote land use development strategies that incorporate pedestrian, bicycle, and transit access and reduce dependency on private vehicles. Partnering with large employers and destinations to support the transit system, explore the various autonomous electric vehicles suitable for public transit, and commit to a pilot program for 1 or 2 of these vehicles. And this one didn't change at all from last time. Our next goal was to continue to support and improve the municipal airport to serve cargo and passenger demands and utilize space to meet community needs. Reassess land use at the airport to support needs in the community, for example, looking at industrial uses. Utilize the airport to support Winona's industries and maintain and expand on those services. Here we're specifically calling out in the strategies, just analyzing what those needs actually are. It was a very general statement last time, and I think that we all kind of know we need to make sure that we know what they are going forward. Issues, concerns? All right. Ignore the highlighting here. We're just highlighting for fun at this point. The next goal was to maintain and expand the commercial harbor and port facilities. The objectives for that were to facilitate improvements to the docking facilities for East End Industries to support and accommodate the riverfront trail and minimize interference with commercial traffic in the main shipping channel. Again, I expect some wordsmithing here. And the next was to evaluate multimodal facility needs and impacts on truck routes and traffic with the goal of not increasing truck volumes. Both of these are carryovers from last plan. This next goal did shift slightly based on our conversation at the last meeting, pursuing track and storage yard relocations. The first objective is the Levy Park rail yard relocation for the use of recreational space and developable land along Levy Park and to promote integration with downtown. That doesn't change. Advocating for Amtrak station and Canadian Pacific rail yard improvements to limit switching movements that impact street crossings and treat the Amtrak station as a welcoming entrance to the city. We talked pretty extensively about that last time. Seeking private partnership for improvements to the surrounding area by the Amtrak statement for reinvestment to meet housing and commercial demand. This is an expansion based on that kind of reinvestment rezoning consideration. So what is that going to look like in 20 years? And assessing the impact of railroads and crossing backups on a regular basis. That doesn't mean every other day. That would be far too bad. It would be something like once or twice every decade. You know, let's make sure that we're actually seeing some progress here. And here we slid under reassessing the Wall Street track and switching movements and work with railroads to improve efficiency and safety. And Brian, you had some really good points. There's a cascading effect if we were to specifically advocate for some tracking or track removal or switching track replacement. And I think analyzing it is probably the best way to promote it, considering our last intermodal study was, I believe, 1996. I'm looking at the two of you, but I want to make sure that's right. So it's been a while. We probably need another one. All right. And so this is where those were all wrapped into that section here. Any questions related to that last one? All right. Our next goal was supporting and enhancing passenger rail service, pursuing improvements to the Amtrak station. Here I moved a couple into the strategy section. So considering staffing needs, volunteered or paid. And then we had a signage component, and then we said strategic communications plan, because we've been kind of targeting that similar language across other subcommittees. Encouraging private reinvestment in the area around the Amtrak station, providing improved wayfinding and informational kiosk. as a welcoming gateway. This is slightly different than doing strategic communications. Provide multimodal access to the location around the Amtrak station. So, making sure that we're treating it like a transit hub. Supporting the historic rehabilitation of the Amtrak station and providing additional interpretive signage that didn't change from last time, and supporting regional rail network planning in the surrounding region. This was a separate advocating for the Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Chicago Railroad, but we know that really that might just be the first of multiple regional things over the next 15 years. So that seems more like a strategy supporting a regional goal. Questions, concerns? I'm seeing a lot of head nods, so I'm just going through. This is nice to be able to kind of run through it because we spent like the last 3 meetings really diving in. So our next goal is revising truck routes through the city. And here we have assessing the current truck routes in the city and pursue a truck routes management system and promote changes that will improve access to the community. I slid this strategy in underneath that. It was a standalone objective before, but it really feels more like it fits underneath that overall technology improvement. Improving livability along the truck routes. This is enforcing the vehicle noise laws on all routes. This was its own standalone objective that I slid under this because it's really we're trying to get at the overarching objective. And create an appropriate design for truck routes that hasn't changed from the last time we spoke. The next goal is pursuing priority road improvements. Consider and reassess the Mankato Avenue North-South corridor for additional capacity along potential Louisa Street extension. You guys did bring that up a couple of times. We didn't explore it as a transformative project, but probably if we do another intermodal study, we'll need to take a look at it. Pursuing investments consistent with the complete streets policy and municipal stated road money. So how do we make sure that we're being consistent with the actual regulatory processes? This was wrapped into multiple different locations. You'll see here I wrote implemented elsewhere in goals and objectives. So forgive me if you want to go back and read it specifically, we can spend some time on it, but otherwise you can also trust me that we put it elsewhere. Prioritizing sidewalks and multimodal access in neighborhoods. Here we were going to reevaluate the Unified Development Code standards for subdivisions. So what does it mean when we say we want sidewalks? And continuing to reinvest in sidewalk maintenance in a section by section approach under the Sidewalk Improvement Program. And here, we always want to ask for more money. I know that Ryan appreciates that if we can. The next goal is implementing the complete streets policy and pedestrian and bicycle plan network and improvements. And here we have the objectives of facilitating the planning process for streets program for multimodal improvements before bringing designs to the public for approval. We talked about this, I think, 2 meetings ago. Our accessible government subcommittee really kind of wanted a more public process approach to that. What that actually means, we'll figure that out. Seeking grant funding and private partnerships for bicycle and pedestrian improvements consistent with the goals of the complete streets policy and pedestrian and bicycle plan and the Parks and Recreation master plan. This is an objective that after discussing things a little bit more in depth, I think that we also need to talk about seeking grant funding just for general maintenance as well. And it's a handy objective to include in a comp plan, because then when we apply for a grant, like a USAID grant or what have you, we can say, yep, it's right here in our comp plan. So we'll add that elsewhere. I just wanted to call it out while we're talking about it. 3, incorporating bicycle parking in the community on public rights of way and off-street parking facilities. This is just kind of reaffirming what we already have in a couple of policy documents. And here we have an allowing of a substitution for bicycles and other multimodal systems. We added transit to that as well. So let's take transit into consideration when we're considering development. Any additional comments or concerns right now? Lots of head nods. I like the head nods. Our next goal is local street improvements that should incorporate narrow street design based on urban street design guidance. And here we talked about last week, or not last week, actually, not like 3.5 weeks ago. I'm so sorry. We talked about how we are going to be using, different standards across time. Obviously, there's things like AASHTO, there are things like NACTA, there are things like the Federal Highway Administration standards. There's the Minnesota MUTCD, all those standards that we all need to apply for. And so we're using just urban street design guidance to recognize that we're a more urban community. Proactively advocate for changes and apply for variances to the municipal state aid roads program when funding street improvements with state monies. And sorry, I meant to add a where appropriate component here. Based on our conversation last time, these 2 here were their own standalone objectives last time. And we want to move that underneath here. I think that kind of fits well with what we were talking about before. Promoting narrow street widths, travel lane widths, parking widths, and intersection crossing distances by following urban street design guidance for appropriate transportation organizations. Again, a little bit general, but we know that people like our lovely city engineer take guidance from multiple different documents. We need him to be able to do that. Emphasizing connectivity in new subdivision design and ensure connections to other subdivisions and the existing street network. Here we're kind of getting at, we want to continue when known as past history of a street grid development. Basically, we know it introduces redundancy that's beneficial. We know it introduces connectivity that's beneficial. These were moved elsewhere up here. Oh, sorry, excuse me. So that's why they're crossed out. Then promoting traffic calming through the community. This was its own standalone objective before. And so, or sorry, its own standalone goal before. And so then we put it in as an objective under here with its sub-objectives and strategies. That's it. That's the whole document, everybody.
It's big.
Big, like big in a good way or big like it's just large?
I have one question
Yes,
under, you were going so fast.
sorry, my
No,
apologies.
that's
We only
good.
have so much time.
Exactly. So under the sidewalk section,
Yes,
so I know there's some redundancy built into the document on
Mhm.
purpose. I'm wondering if it merits, the only once in the document is this goal to continue towards ADA accessibility
Mm.
mentioned, and this would be a great section to just reiterate that one more time.
absolutely. So implement the ADA transition plan. Do we implement the transition plan on new sidewalks? Or is it just considered an ongoing document for that?
I guess I would assume probably just kind of ongoing, but I guess I don't know for sure.
Outcomes, we'll just say the outcomes from that. For sidewalk improvements. Perfect. And I can take a look at a strategy to fill that in.
So, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. I think that's great.
You did a good job.
Yeah, it's really great.
You guys are the ones who talked at me. I just, as long as it reflects what you guys talked and said into the world, that's what matters most to us. Is there anything that sticks out like a sore thumb that we didn't talk about over the last few weeks? Months, excuse me.
For the last 17 meetings.
There's only been 7 meetings, not 17. Don't add 10 meetings onto this, that's bad. So the next step for this process is to bring this to our steering committee. The steering committee is going to begin reviewing subcommittee recommendations next Thursday on the 8th of September. We are looking for one member from every subcommittee who would be willing to step forward to speak about how the conversation went, basically. Carlos and I can fill in the actual individual details of objectives and strategies and goals, just to make sure that they're getting that comprehensive document. We are anticipating 2 workshop sessions after that we've had these presentations from the subcommittee members. So at this point, it's just a fire hose of information and processed information going to the steering committee. Does anybody here feel comfortable lending their voice to that moment on the 8th, 11 o'clock to 1 p.m.? Seeing some head shakes. If people are too busy, Mitch Johnson, whose name I should know, has mentioned that he's comfortable being voluntold. I'm seeing head nods about that type of process.
I think he'll be great at it.
And Mitch is very passionate about like some of the bike related bike stuff, and I think, he voices that well, stuff on there, but
I think I may be available if he needs to wiggle out of it.
Okay, that's good to know.
The timing works for me.
And Brian, I'm not going to ask you because you are on the planning commission and the steering committee.
Very good, thank you.
Don't remind me.
All right, so that's what we'll go ahead and do. So process beyond that. So we're going to do those 2 meetings with the steering committee from subcommittee members and 2 workshop meetings with them. And then we're going to begin drafting this plan. That first draft, we are going to invite all of the subcommittee members back to take a look at what we kind of have so that people can intermingle, make sure their ideas still feel reflected. And please note, things are going to change over time, and this will always be a draft until city council adopts it. So there's lots to consider as we go forward. That first draft we're anticipating releasing before the holiday season, so people actually have time to take a look at it. All right. Okay. I'm so excited that we're getting to this process.
I
You
bet
guys,
you are.
the relief is like, I don't know if you can hear the relief in my voice, but there is relief in my voice. All right. Any final questions, comments?
This is a minor point, but how is Lake Boulevard considered a calming street? Is that the one by the band shell?
No, that's Lake Street.
That's Lake Park Drive.
Or Lake Park
Oh,
Drive.
There's 800 Lake.
Lake Boulevard
Streets.
is the one on the other side of 61, so there's West Lake and East Lake. Yeah.
Okay,
And those have the intention of being a bike boulevard at some point, which would include traffic calming elements. But right now it's 24 feet wide. And I know some people try and use it as an alternative to the highway.
The speed limit is 55 on it, right?
I think we must-
Yeah.
I think it's
55.
Oh,
Yeah.
we gotta change that.
That's awkward.
We're gonna watch for you. Yeah,
so it's not right now.
but we would treat that as kind of that more minutia based policy document. So for the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, for the Complete Streets and Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan, those types of elements to kind of recommend what that would look like in the
Okay.
future, and then ultimately design process as well. And we have money. We'll be able to go.
I just
after
thought it sounded like it was already used as because it was
Oh.
calm,
that. I don't know that I would describe it as particularly
Calm.
right?
calm when people are out there.
No.
I do think that having the Sugarloaf trailhead there and all the cars
Mhm.
parked there does slow down that one section.
That one,
though.
Yeah.
That one section is nice. Yeah. All right,
The only thing I would have, I guess, kind of like we talked about with the traffic calming stuff, that stuff needs to be kind of a street by street, case by case
Yeah.
basis. Based on, I guess, engineering, that stuff is, I guess, the only thing that I'm kind of stuck on is, I don't wanna say, hey, we have to do
right,
this method every single street, when every single street's kind of its own animal.
right. And I think that the
So-
current plan is very specific. We've been talking about this.
Yeah.
The current plan is very specific. When we were going through the current plan, I believe it was Mitch who actually mentioned that he really likes that we have very specific components there,
Mm.
but we've never been able to practically implement. any of it
I
anyway.
mean, that's just like a lot of those, it's just not feasible. I wouldn't feel safe implementing a lot of that stuff, so I think we need something in there. Street by street basis, or, something,
And
just to make sure we're looking at everything. Before we implement something.
I think the language. Apparently, I don't have context in here. That's not right. So we kept saying things like consider context sensitive design elements here.
Okay.
Is kind of what we're going for there. We're using the phrase context sensitive for a handful of things across the comp plan that I think is trying to get what we're getting to. We're doing it with housing policy as well as context sensitive housing policy. What looks like Winona, what feels like Winona, what fits the actual situation on the ground.
That'd be a good call out definition box.
Yeah, that's actually really good. Yeah, that's a good point.
There were a few of those highlighted at accessible government.
Mhm.
So that might be another good one, just to
Right.
specify what context sensitive
Yeah.
design means, and it means that having
Yeah,
consideration based on each individual block.
Right.
yeah, that would be great.
So I only put it in there, what, 9 or 12 times, I think.
Perfect.
One,
Eight
two,
times,
three,
8 times. That's not that great, but it's pretty good.
I think it definitely deserves.
Yeah.
Box.
All right. Any further comments or concerns? All right, if there are none, I will be in contact with Mitch, and if not Mitch, I'll be in contact with Diane, and your work until a few months from now is done.
Until you call Renee next.
Your work never ends because we work together,
Yeah.
but the rest of you, your work is done. I want to thank you all very much for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure working with you. You were a great group, and
The best though.
In this room, the best.
thank you. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all.